Where's my battery? Good. Господи. Ай, капец. Okay. Da-da-da. Okay. Alrighty. Hello. Alrighty. Welcome back. Happy Friday the 13th. Ooh, spooky. All right. So, sorry, my brain is half engaged. I don't know why. It's Friday, I think, middle of the semester, right? We're about to hit week 7 out of 14. So, I mean, I guess the good news is you're almost halfway there. So, I don't know. Or the bad news is you're only halfway there. All right. So, we're going to keep going with socialization in a second here. But first, I'd like to do some freestyle rap. No, I'm kidding. You know, I'm dropping my mixtape today. No, I'm kidding. So for the exam, right? I think I have basically everyone's done the exam now. And I think I have answered everyone's emails who wanted to come in and see it. If you sent me an email and I have not answered you yet, could you just find that email and hit the old forward button and send it back to me sometime in the next couple of days? Because I spent like an hour this morning, while my 4-year-old was watching Blippi, which is a trauma I don't care to talk about, answering my email. So I think I got everybody. If I didn't, please send me another one. Okay. If the class average is above 90, and just keep in mind, y'all scored at like 76. So if the class average for the second midterm pulls above a 90, I will 100% do a freestyle rap. And that's on you for asking. Because I guarantee you it will not be good and it will not be pretty. So yes, if the class somehow improves by 14% on the second midterm, A, I'm going to check security, and B, I will freestyle rap for you 100%. I will also do some jazz style scatting for you. It'll be great. Oh, all right. What were you? Let's get into this. Or maybe I'll just throw Rocket League up on the screen and I'll play it off my laptop and you can see how bad I am. On PC especially. Okay. So we were talking last time, we were talking socialization, right? How do people become individuals? How do they become social subjects, right? How do they go from unformed blobby baby to, a person with attitudes, opinions, ability to interact with the world with an identity? Okay, and we ended off on this slide, right? Basically talking about the fact that where you are born, when you are born, plays a huge role into who you become. And I accused you all of being potential Nazis if you had been born in the 1930s in Germany. I'm kidding, of course, and also not. But the potential is there. If you'd grown up in the Soviet Union in the 1960s, you probably would have been communists, and so on and so forth, right? Where you're born, who you're raised by, the social environment around you shapes you very, very deeply. And as you move through the life course, right, you go through different stages of life. These change from one historical period to another. And one of the things that has typically marked the way people move through the life course are these rites of passage that we talked about last time. What the? I don't. Is this English? There's too many W's in this sentence. I'm gonna go with that. Okay, I don't know what that means. I'm way too tired. I've been, I'm sure you can appreciate this. I wake up at 5 every morning with this impending sense of dread that I have work waiting for me. And yesterday I just gave into it at 5 and got up and started working, and I worked till basically 4:30 in the afternoon, like straight, basically without stopping. And then today I woke up again at 5 and I'm like, there are so many things I need to do. Shut up. That's what I said to my phone. I'm not talking to you. No, if the class average is below 20, you all have to do a freestyle rap for me. That's the deal. Like as a class, like a flash mob, freestyle rap. That's how it's going to go. I'm sure it would be great. Anyway, I don't know what I'm doing. Brain, activate. Okay, there's coffee in here. All right. So yeah, what was I saying? I'm tired. And we're halfway through the semester, so we're grinding down. But I made progress. Okay. I know I said this last time. There would be, yeah. So I'll give you a date. I'm not sure exactly. Sorry, my schedule's a little bit unfixed. But I want to either a Tuesday or Thursday, I'll have an afternoon where I'll just be in my office from like 1 till 4, and you can just stop by. But I will send out an announcement on eClass telling you when that will be. Otherwise, just make an appointment with me. All right. Clear. All right. So sorry. Let me go back here. So yeah, different times, different places, we have different concepts. All right. So how does this work in principle, right? One of the things that I think is really, really interesting in terms of even how we think about the life course kind of playing out is that depending on when you were born, your concept of, say, what childhood and adolescence are ultimately would be very different, right? So some of the things that we think of as these very natural categories, right? You're a baby, and then you're a child, and then you're a teenager or an adolescent, and then you become an adult, right? Are actually really kind of socially contingent on the kind of historical period that you're in, right? So if you look back, and there's been lots of really interesting accounts of this, if you went back into a pre-industrial society, right? So if you went back even into England, prior to 1700, what you would find is that, they have kind of a concept of childhood. It is a much different concept of childhood than we have, right? We've sort of developed this concept of childhood, where childhood is this time of innocence, right? Where people are protected and shielded from, the adult world and from work as we prepare them, over this incredibly long period for, participation in economic and social life. But it was not always thus, I said in my good fake Victorian English. In the past, children were expected to work, right? Basically from the time that a child was 5 or 6, they would have been treated essentially like a kind of small adult, right? They would have been given tasks, on the family farm or in the workshop where their parents worked, or sent away at a very young age to apprentice to become a tradesman. Because, economic life was different. So we didn't really have a concept of childhood that was, that was this period of kind of protected time where people could just be innocent and play all the time. That emerges fundamentally from two forces, from the printing press and the fact that to become an adult, you needed to learn how to read, and from industrialization, right? Where once we get enough excess that children don't have to work, then you can have this bit of leisure to raise children as these sort of innocent beings. Adolescence is an even more recent term, right? We don't have the word adolescent in any language, but the first language that really has it is English, until really the 19th century, when G. Stanley Hall kind of coins the term. It comes out, you have, sort of people, smaller people, but once people start to really study children, right, they're like, well, there's this weird phase where children, start to develop sexually and they get grumpy and they won't get out of bed in the morning. And, somebody, G. Stanley Hall, names that adolescence, right? So adolescence, relatively recent term. I don't know if you'd be surprised to learn the word teenager actually is an even more recent word. Teenager as a term actually was first used in the New York Times in 1957. So it's actually a really, really recent invention. Now, as it goes today, right, we have even a third. So, once you have this extended period where you can kind of shield people from full adult life, you have childhood, you have adolescence, and now, a lot of sociologists, and, if you take sociology of youth with me, we'll talk about this in great detail, because, now it's required for you to really get ahead in life, for you to take a university degree at least, or some kind of post-secondary, maybe going into a master's degree. And there's this extended period where young adults kind of go through and aren't getting married, aren't settling down until really almost their 20th or their 30th birthday. Sociologists have started to talk about the period from 19 to about 29 as a new period, emerging adulthood, right? So good news, you won't really be a true adult until you're 30. Enjoy that from a sociological perspective. Because, right, we've had these really, really long periods of development where we kind of think that people aren't fully formed. But this fundamentally is the result of, industrialization and having a lot of excess wealth that allows us to shelter our children from adult life for a long period of time and from things like work. Obviously, if you went to other places in the world that are poorer, right, that might not be the case and certainly was not the case in history. So you're very kind of, the way you kind of move through the life course and what's expected of you at different stages is fundamentally kind of a result of the place and time in history that you come from. Okay. So, do we get to the topic of nature versus nurture? That is a psychology way of thinking. Thank you. No, we may talk about it a little bit, but not specifically in those terms because we don't do psychology in this class. We're better than that. No, I'm kidding. Psychologists are fine. They're just discount sociologists. It's all good. So have I told you my boss's joke when she found out the psychologists had their own library? She's like, but psychologists don't read books, which someone might find insulting. Okay, pre-1957 were teenagers classified as children or young adults. So we already had the term adolescent, but the term teenager, right? So thinking of teenager, in this very when you enter the teen years of your kind of age, that is a term that we don't have until 1957. But people had already been developing this idea of adolescence since the 19th century. So it was, already ensconced, but this new word, teenager, we don't get until the 50s. And then, things like tweens, that's like a 2000s term, all this fun stuff. Emerging adults, 2007. So these terms change over time. Okay. So a couple of the ways that we've started to measure this, right? Specifically, probably since the beginning of the 20th centuries, of the 1900s, we started to measure kind of how people move through the life course and how they're marked by the events that were happening, especially when they were young, by age cohorts and what we call generational cohorts, right? So an age cohort, right, basically when we talk about it sociologically is a category of people born in the same age range of years, right? So generally, when we're talking about, if you're doing a sociological study and you want to know about certain people, right, you're going to group them into kind of an age range, right? So 18 to 24, 25 to 32 or whatever, right? That's an age cohort. Age roles, right? Age roles are basically the different kind of expectations we have of people in different age cohorts, right? We expect 30-year-olds to act differently than 15-year-olds for obvious reasons, and senior citizens to act differently than teenagers, hopefully. Okay, and generational cohorts. So basically, generational cohorts are typically the way that we use almost like a quick cheat in sociology to refer to a kind of age cohort that shares a bunch of formative experiences, basically, during their first few decades of life, right? So right up until about the 20s, 24, 25. And when you look through a lot of the kind of sociological data, a lot of times when we're talking, we're going to lump people into these cohorts and treat them all kind of like they had the same formative experiences, right? So generations most likely to form during periods of intense social change. And a really recent book that came out that's really, really interesting, which I'm not entirely through, actually titled Generations by a psychologist named Jean Twenge, argues that the biggest formative experiences that separate one generational cohort from another are actually the introduction of new technologies, right? Okay, so some of the ones that you might kind of hear bandied about in sociology, right, is things like the greatest generation. Now, most of these folks are no longer with us, right? The greatest generation, now would be, the youngest of them would be nearly 100 years old. But these were, the people who essentially would have fought in World War II, grown up during the Great Depression, right? Born 1901 to 1928. And they're mostly past now. The silents, right? So these are the silents are now, entering their 80s. Joe Biden, and Donald Trump, I think, are both technically silent generation. I can't remember when Trump's birthday is now. I don't care enough to find out. I think he's either he might be a boomer, actually. Joe Biden definitely is a silent generation, sometimes known as the traditionalist or the lucky generation, because they got all the benefits of the post-war kind of era without having to, they were too young to fight in the Second World War. They are now, entering their 80s, which means that they dominate, the US Congress, but nothing else. The Congress is very old for reasons I can't explain. The boomers, right? So boomers, a very, very important generational demographic. Why? Well, because the boomers were this enormous generational cohort, right? They're basically, their parents are either the greatest generation or the silent generation. And basically they, the boomers were born just after the Second World War, like roughly 1946 till 1965, I think is a little long. There's different ranges that people use. 46 to probably about 62, 63, maybe 65 at the outside. It was a huge generational cohort, right? They call it the baby boomers because after the Second World War, there's all this prosperity. And people had, right up until the beginning of the 1960s, there's no birth control. So big families, right? So typical families would have been, 4 or 5, all the way up to like 7. I think the average children per woman is something in the range of about 3.8, which is, pretty high by Western standards. So it's a huge demographic, and it reshapes Western society in really important ways, right? So this is the generation that would have, fought or would have been drafted to fight in Vietnam. They were the hippies, right? They were, the ones who mostly lived through the big effects of the sexual revolution. And they're also the generation that in a lot of ways will not go away. In terms, especially American politics, for whatever reason, still dominated in large part by these baby boomers, the oldest of whom, right, are now, in their mid 70s, mid to late 70s, and just will not retire. Even the business world, right, still marked by a lot of boomers hanging on for dear life in these high positions. Who's the guy at Disney? Bob Iger? He's like 71. He's a baby boomer. It's like, just retire already. Jeez, you ruined Star Wars. Get out of here. He did. It's all his fault. That and J.J. Abrams, who I don't know what he looks like, but if I ever find out, he's in trouble. He ruined Star Trek and Star Wars. I hate him so much. Anyway, neither here nor there. So the boomers, a really huge generational cohort and still with us. And, when they talk about, Canada having an upside down demographic where we're going to have almost more retirees than workers, that's because the boomers are getting into their retirement years. Okay. Generation X or Gen X, Gen Xers, roughly kind of mid 1960s to the early part of the 1980s. A very small generational cohort in comparison, right? So maybe because birth control just came on the scene. For whatever reason, the Gen X is a pretty small generational cohort in terms of population. As opposed to the boomers, they faced a period of kind of slow economic growth and what's kind of referred to as the stagflation of the 1970s and 80s, right? They had a hard time launching into adulthood. The boomers had taken up all the jobs, so they were kind of stuck. They were the generation two that started to feel the effects of globalization, where a lot of those good manufacturing jobs that used to be available started to shift over to East Asia. And, a lot of those jobs left, leaving working class people with less options. All right, and then the millennials, probably the best generation of all. I only say that because I barely make it into this generational cohort, just barely. So first generation to come of age in the 21st century, right? So basically they're called millennials. Why? Because most of them, basically if you put it at 1982, they'll be turning 18, right at the year 2000, right? So at the turn of the millennium, they are the millennials, right? For a while, everyone was calling them Gen Y, and I'm profoundly happy that got left behind, because it's just derivative. What comes after Gen X? Gen Y. Millennials is much better. They're now the largest living generation because the boomers have started to die, though not the ones in Congress for some reason. Because we must be ruled by the elderly or Justin Trudeau forever. But yeah, more ethnically. So Friday. I didn't do my vocal warm-ups. Okay. I just trip over my own tongue sometimes. They're very ethnically diverse generational cohort, right? Driven principally by immigration, right? As the birth rate got much lower, Canada and the US especially started to bring in more immigrants from more parts of the world, right? And as nobody wanted to go, to come in from Europe anymore because Europe got all prosperous and hoity-toity, stopped having wars amongst themselves. No fun. I'm kidding. War's not good. But basically, right, they needed immigrants from other places, so they brought in people from Asia, the Middle East, Africa, and so the millennials are a very, very diverse generation. It's also the most educated generation in history in terms of earning college degrees, because increasingly the economy started to demand it. Now, I don't have it on my list, and I should have added it, but I forgot. The generation that most of you will be a part of is referred to as Gen Z at the moment. Kind of hoping someone comes up with a better name for y'all, because Gen Z is not great. I like Zoomer. That's my preferred one for whatever reason, mostly because y'all got to live on Zoom for 3 years during the pandemic. So I think you should all be called Zoomers. Nobody listens to me, so if you don't like it, don't worry. Basically, this is the generation born, roughly this millennials to early 2000s is probably a little bit too wide. 1995-ish to about 2012. And again, this is the generation arguably that's been most formed by smartphones and the advent of the smartphone as the key technology. And then after that, we're still debating names, but some people are calling the generation just after Gen Z, so kind of 2012 forward, either Generation Alpha, which is dumb, or Generation Prime, which is also dumb. But I'm sure we'll come up with a good name for them at some point. Okay. I should see if there's any questions. Do you have to know the dates for each generation? Wait, where are the questions? Too many questions. Do you have to know the dates for each generation? No, don't worry. It won't be that specific. Why is the silent generation called the lucky generation when many of their because they got to see all the benefits. So they got to see all the benefits of the post-war economic boom, right? There was a huge economic boom after the Second World War that basically lasted about 20 years, right up until from 1945 right up until 1973. So even, a little bit more than 20 years. And they got to really benefit from that in ways that other generations didn't. J.J. Abrams is, by the way, the worst. Lost was a crappy show that ended stupidly, and I hate him. But mostly because he ruined Star Trek, and a little bit because he ruined Star Wars. But beyond that, yes. What is Trudeau mania? Oh, my poor, sweet students. Trudeau mania, yes. It's all about Pierre Elliott Trudeau, the politician with 17 names and one son, who we need to talk about, and a bunch of others who did nothing with their lives. Trudeau mania, right? When Trudeau came on the scene in the 1970s, he was like a political rock star. And yeah, people called the kind of fervent adder with which Canadians, especially from the East, embraced Mr. Pierre Elliott Trudeau, Trudeau mania, kind of following from Beatles mania, right? He had that same kind of suave, charismatic thing that you find in evil dictators. Star Wars turned bad when they made the first film. Oh, not a Star Wars fan, I take it. Okay. Do you mean the first film or the first film, which is actually number 4? I don't remember. Star Wars is confusing. Okay. Did the economic... Oh, okay. Well, now we're getting... Hang on. Yeah, Gen Z... okay, there's debate as to when generations end. Gen Z, 1996 to 2010, could be. Some people put it there. I put it a little earlier and a little bit later. Okay, do Gen Z and millennials overlap? Yes, there's a Pierre Elliott Trudeau quote. Just watch me. I mean, there's always these kind of weird overlaps between generations where people feel awkwardly like they're more part of like the past generation than the one they're actually lumped into. I have a good friend. Her name is Paige, and we were having a conversation where she said, "Oh, millennials are the worst," and she's a year younger than me, so she's clearly a millennial, and she's like they're the worst. They're lazy and entitled. I'm like, Paige, you're a millennial, and she's like, what? No. I'm Gen X. I'm like, no, Gen X ends literally by every measure at least a year before you were born. So you are definitely a millennial. But sometimes people will say, like, my sister, who's a couple years older than me, she classes herself as a Zennial, right? An X millennial, because she's on the cusp between Gen X and millennials. Because there's always a little bit of overlap, especially towards the end of generation and beginnings of generational cohorts, where people feel a little bit awkwardly lumped in there. There's also people that call themselves Zennials, like with a Z. So they're Gen Z and millennial, but now I've gone into too much detail. How did the silent generation experience post-war boom? Oh, I answered that. Okay, Gracie Abrams, I don't know who that is. I assume someone related to J.J. Abrams. Did the economic boom last until the Cold War? Okay, so the Cold War would have started arguably, perhaps in the 50s, if you want to count like Berlin airlift. But really, we can talk about the Cold War starting immediately after the Second World War, so like 1946, and ending either 1989 or 1991. So the Cold War would... the economic boom would have been at the beginning part of the Cold War. So, okay, that's a heart with hands. For a second, I thought that was lips, and that would have been awkward. So I'm like, what is that? Oh, heart with heart hands. Oh, that's better than lips. Okay, I'm good. Okay. Sorry. All right. So, humans, right? Caught in my own joke. Hang on a sec. Very tired. Yeah, so human beings, right, when we talk about their social influences, basically we're constantly surrounded by influences, either real or imagined others, right, who are constitute our social environment. Okay, so your question might be like, okay, you know what real others are, right? What is an imagined other? Well, sometimes, right, we kind of imagine ourselves in communion with people that we have not actually met. There's a really famous and interesting book by a guy named Benedict Anderson. It's called Imagined Communities, about how nations kind of think about themselves, right? How the nation state kind of works. And he's like, and one of the things he says is that as a member of kind of a city or a country or a province or whatever, you might not, that there's people out there, other Edmontonians, Albertans, Canadians, that you imagine yourself somehow connected to, but you've never met them and you probably never will. And it's just an imagined other that lives out there, right? So you imagine that there's a bunch of Canadians that share your values, out there somewhere in the world that make up this community of Canadians, right? So we're in kind of constant interaction with both the real people around us and a bunch of people we imagine are probably part of our whatever communities we're part of as well. Okay, so, what we do as human beings, in a sense, is constantly going through this process of adaptation, where we're basically trying to shape our individual or arrange our individual actions in such a way as to kind of gain the environment, our social environment's cooperation, and, in satisfying our needs and our interests, right? So you're constantly trying to, arrange your kind of actions in such a way as to increase the benefits to yourself, right? So you're trying to get me to give you an extension on your assignment, right? Or another professor, right? And so you write your letter very politely, or you come and knock on their door during office hours, and you're like, my dog was killed by a car accident right after my grandmother had a heart attack. Oh, please, Professor Broussard, would you give me an extension? I'm like, that's your third grandmother this semester. True story. Actually, I had this happen once where someone literally in one semester, 3 grandmothers died. I was like, isn't that third grandmother? They're like, well, she's not my real grandmother. It's just sort of someone I call my grandmother. I'm like, you pivoted quickly, so I give it to you. Caught in a lie, but you handled it well. So, right, you're constantly trying to gain the cooperation of others, right? You try to get people to like you, to be your friends, to be your romantic partners, right? To give you the things that you want, and all of that fun stuff. All right, so, and socialization, fundamentally an evolutionary or kind of progressive process, right? Basically, in any environment, a person acts on their existing characteristics and interests, right? The environment responds, right? So people treat you in a certain way, right? You come to office hours and you're rude, or you forget to include, dear Professor Broussard, or more importantly, what class you're in. This is my pet peeve with emails. We're like, I need an extension on the assignment for this class. I'm like, I teach 4 classes per term. If you could be slightly more specific, that would be super helpful. So yes, always include the class number. But the environment responds, right? You get shot down by that person you had a crush on, and then you shape your conduct, to either reinforce existing patterns or encourage change, right? You basically try to get new things out of the environment based on, what happened, right? Your crush turns you down, so you start hitting the gym, bulk up, and then try again with someone else or the same person. Or, just never give up and hopelessly crush on that person for all of time. Okay, rip step grandmother. Yeah, that was a good one. Well, my aunt, who I call my grandmother, she's my grandmother twice removed. She's actually my mother's second cousin. Okay. You can see it happening, right? How many times have you pretend claimed that your grandmother has died? More than once, I must guess. Some people have actually provided me with death certificates, though, which is a little awkward. Like, I didn't really need that, but thanks. I'm proving to you that my grandmother died. Here's her obituary and death certificate. It's like, oh yeah, I would have just believed you, but okay, that's cool. She was very old. Okay. I'm in a funny mood today. I'm really sorry. I'm just in a strange mood. It's the fatigue and the fact that I think this is the bottom cup of my second pot of coffee today, so. All right, so functionalists, conflict theorists, symbolic interactionists, how do they look at socialization? Okay, so functionalists will look at socialization and say that it is really key to maintaining an orderly social relationships, right? It's part of how you learn how to navigate society. So socialization ends up being really important to make sure all of those institutions work well and you know how to navigate them. Conflict theorists and feminists, because they hate everything. I'm kidding. Again, I'm in a silly mood. Typically stress that a lot of socialization ends up putting people into roles that might not ultimately be good for them, right? That might in some way be oppressing them, right? So that socialization creates stress and discord based on class, right? You're socialized as working class, and then you're trapped in the working class. You can never get out because you don't know how to talk good, and or something, I don't know. Or you just don't have the right values to move yourself out and to get that social capital that moves you out of that class. On gender, right, especially feminists are concerned about this, that women are socialized in more, we'll say traditionally feminine ways, to be more nurturing, more caring, socialized to go into, the typically female professions, teaching, nursing, and social work, which keeps them from getting access to the really good paying jobs in science, technology, engineering, and math. And why do they do that? Because they've been told that they're more nurturing. Since they were little, they were encouraged to play with dolls. So they, ultimately adopted those roles, right? And other divisions, right? And you can see where, all sorts of other divisions are possible. Religion and all other things, right? People are socialized into these things to divide them and keep them separated. And then symbolic interactionists, because they're the wacky fun sociologists, highlight the creativity of individuals in attaching meaning to their social surroundings and how people, are not really trapped in it, but they can negotiate their identities. And socialization gives them kind of the base materials, which they then build identities out of based on their own kind of agency and individual choice. It's 12:36. All right. I'm like, there's a lot of time left. This is probably good. I can go fast and make up for all the jokes. All right. Families. So when we talk about socialization, families are the most important agent of socialization because they get there first, right? So this is why we refer to families as the agent of primary socialization. Because, before you go to school or have friends or whatever, you have parents of some kind and siblings, right? Well, maybe not siblings, increasingly not. The average birth rate for Gen Z Canadians appears to be about 1.2 children per woman, which suggests that many people will not have siblings in the future. Which my daughter would say, that sounds pretty good. Having a 4-year-old brother, I think, is hard. He likes to wake her up. She does not like to be woken. All right, so family is the locus of primary socialization, right? Because it gets there first. So it exerts an enduring influence upon you, right? This is why when they say, you will become your parents, that is unfortunate and kind of true. My wife is definitely becoming like her mother. But unlike me, because I am perfect, I am not becoming like my father at all. I'm lying. I'm exactly like my dad. Okay. So it exerts a long influence, right? The values that your family teaches you, the religion or non-religion that your family has, right? The beliefs that they carry will carry with you for a long time, even in ways that you sometimes find it hard to appreciate and that you'll only become aware of many years later when you look in the mirror and realize that you've become your father. It is an uncomfortable moment. Okay. Sorry, I was about to make a joke in Greek, but that would be wasted. So let's just move on. Okay, schools. Schools are probably our most important locus of what we call secondary socialization, right? Because outside of your family, school is where you're going to spend the bulk of your time in your formative years. So, teachers and peers become really, really important in shaping people's values, right? So, some of the battles that are going on right now, around schools, right, where people are concerned that schools are indoctrinating their kids or not indoctrinating their kids enough, I don't know which one, is all about this kind of process of secondary socialization, a recognition that you're going to spend a lot of time in school, and so school is going to have a very big influence on who you ultimately become, because a lot of values are going to be communicated to you in school. And this has been long known, right? Like when the Canadian government was setting up public schools in Canada, it was with the idea of forming, immigrant communities into Canadians with particular values. The residential schools, right, were all along this line. It's like, if we can get them young, we can shape them into Canadians instead of Indigenous people, right? As we realize that the school has in residential schools, obviously being boarding schools, also had a lot of power because you're taking people out of their families. But we recognize that school can have a really enduring influence on who people become. Okay, a conflict theory argument is that the school often has both its kind of stated curriculum, your reading, your writing, your math, or the 3 R's, reading, writing, and arithmetic, which the R is the second letter in arithmetic, but okay. I never figured out why it was the 3 R's, but anyway. But it also has a sort of hidden curriculum, values that are instilled in people by the schools that aren't, in a sense, are kind of a latent function. but are still there. So like conflict theorists will argue that schools, essentially coming out of the industrial period or the period of industrialization, are really good at forming, the equivalent of future factory workers, right? Where you sit, you listen to authority, right? There's a teacher, that person is the authority figure, and you listen to that person like you're going to listen to your boss on the factory floor later on. So it teaches obedience and conformity to cultural norms, right? That basically you're going to go along with the group. So like, I know, I was going to make another Nazi reference. I'm just going to skip it. If your teacher's a Nazi, well, something's gone wrong. Anyway, maybe you're at the U of A and you have a scholarship. I don't know. Sorry, we have some Nazi scholarships apparently. That's where the joke is coming. All right, but I don't know why I made that joke. It was terrible. I'm going to edit that out of the recording later. I'm just going to edit all the jokes out and the lecture is going to be like 4 minutes. All right. So yeah, the hidden curriculum, right? So there's lots of arguments too that the hidden curriculum, and this has become really the case with, say, critical race theorists, right, who are from a conflict theory school kind of surrounding race, that the curriculum has taught whiteness, right? That it's taught that, European civilization was the best, and that the values of Europeans are themselves superior to those of other people. And it does so in ways, by doing things like starting the history of Canada with the arrival of Europeans rather than talking about Indigenous people, or starting American history with Columbus, right, or Plymouth Rock, or something, or the Pilgrims coming to Plymouth Rock, right, rather than looking at the Indigenous people who were already here. And, by emphasizing certain things in like literature, right, I assume you still all read Shakespeare. So you read Shakespeare. Why? Because it's the pinnacle of English playwriting. And that's part of the hidden curriculum, right? Telling you what the good things are and what the bad things are. And, it's European, the canon of literature, European history, European values, and all that are the best. Okay, and what's been the argument from conflict theorists, and Pierre Bourdieu makes this argument particularly, that students from poor and from racial minority families often find themselves rejecting the hidden curriculum and then coming into clash with the school system because their values aren't reflected. They know it, they push against it, but then the school system itself kind of rejects them. Okay. The meaning of conformity. All right. Good joke. I like it. Conformity. Conformity is just following like the basic norms, right? Doing what everyone else does. Listening to Taylor Swift, in fact, is conformity. Anyway, I don't like Taylor that much. Pretending that Taylor Swift's music is good, right? Or pretending that J.J. Abrams is a talented filmmaker. That's conformity. All right. So, interactionists. Ah, yes, my friends, the interactionists. All right, so symbolic interactionists are funny in terms of socialization because they look at the world and they will say, because they see the world in a sense as socially constructed, and that much of how we actually end up is in relation to how we interpret symbols. They have these couple of terms that are related, right? These two concepts are really related that have to do with how the social world impacts how we act and how we move through life. So the first one here is what's called the Thomas theorem, right? And basically it says situations we define as real become real in their consequence. So what does that mean in principle, right? So there's this very famous experiment where basically, these researchers came in, gave students an IQ test in the class, and then reported to their teachers a bunch of fake scores, right? And so they just randomly took students and said, these students are gifted, and these students are average, right? And so what happened then was that the teachers, believing that that group of students was gifted, started to treat them as though they were gifted. And when the researchers came back in 6 months and administered IQ tests and then gave the real scores, those students had markedly improved up into gifted levels. And what they concluded was because the teachers believed that those kids were gifted, they treated them as if they were gifted, gave them extra help and support, and then, lo and behold, their test scores started to reflect it. So sometimes, we act as though something is true and it becomes true as a consequence, right? We believe that Canada exists as a country, even though, there are no actual lines on the globe, and it becomes a country as a consequence. So sometimes the things that we define as real become real because we define them as such. All right, so that's the Thomas theorem. Self-fulfilling prophecies, right? An expectation that helps bring about what it predicts. So a self-fulfilling prophecy is kind of as follows, right? You believe that you're going to do terrible on your sociology 100 second midterm because, your parents treat you like you're dumb and everyone's told you your whole life that you were an idiot. And so you don't believe in yourself. So you're going to do bad on your SOS 100 exam, even though it is entirely a fair exam created by a generous professor who always treats his students well. But the night before the exam, instead of studying, you go out with your friends to the bar. You knock back, a half dozen drinks. You're a little bit hungover when the exam comes. And lo and behold, you did bad, right? So you believed something was going to happen, and so it did happen, right? It is what we call a self-fulfilling prophecy. Because you prophesied, then you took actions that brought that thing to pass, right? Because Taylor Swift believes that she's eventually going to break up with that football player she's currently dating, she eventually will break up with him and write a song about it. That was pretty good. Her self-fulfilling prophecy that she always breaks up with her boyfriends and writes songs about them will in fact bring that about. Come see me in 1 year when that song comes out. And tell me, because I will not be listening to it. That's a self-fulfilling prophecy. Okay, how much time do we have left? 4 minutes. Intriguing. Would I say the hidden curriculum is still prominent in today's educational system? There's been a lot of work to undo the hidden curriculum. People have talked about decolonizing the curriculum especially, and that's been an effort to get rid of this hidden curriculum. But I think most CRT scholars would still think that it's there. Okay, 3 minutes left. Let's just call it a day. I can't make any more bad jokes. We'll see you on Monday. Have a great weekend. All right.